Okay, hello everyone. If you can take your seats and we'll begin the next panel discussion. My name's Michael Campbell. I'm chairman of the Wilberforce Society, which is a student think tank, the first one set up based here in Cambridge. And I'll be chairing this session on how governments and international organizations can influence development. We're very pleased to have three very knowledgeable speakers here today. I'll introduce them as they come up to speak because we're a bit short of time. The format will be 15-minute presentations from each one of our speakers, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. So our first speaker is Professor Terry McKinley, who is the director at the Center for Development Policy and Research. He's also a professor of development at SOAS in London. And before that, Professor McKinley was a United Nations Development Program advisor on economic policies and poverty reduction. Professor McKinley.
Thank you very much to the Marshall Society, Ravi and others for organizing this very interesting conference. I'm certainly happy to be here. I like the fact that you posted a picture of me from a few years ago. That's very flattering. When it was darker earlier in the podium, I thought you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, but now it's quite bright. How are we doing here? Okay. You can see, and I'll try to be relatively quick, just a short presentation. And you can see from the title, it is sort of a takeoff on the general title of the conference, the road ahead. So instead of looking ahead immediately, I'm looking backwards, in a sense, at what we've gone through in the recent past, especially on global development frameworks and the role of international organizations. When the organizers of the conference thought about somebody, I guess, to talk about international organizations, they looked at my background and said, well, you must be quite qualified to do that. And it is true, I spent many years in UNDP. So let me start with some initial reflections on UNDP itself as sort of an example. UNDP, as you probably know, is an international organization, part of the UN system. It's supposed to be independent, but if you really looked at the way it's financed, you'd find that its core financing, which comes through the UN system without any strings attached, is mainly designed to finance its administration, its structure. But over time, especially starting in the 1990s, what we found is that non-core financing, namely tied financing from individual bilateral donors, was the primary source for financing programs. So really, in a sense, when you look at some of the implications of this arrangement, the individual bilateral donors, most of them in Europe or the US, determine the priorities of UNDP. So in practice, UNDP, even though it was a UN organization you would think would be independent, had limited maneuvering room. Another problem that not just affected UNDP, but also affected other organizations in the UN system as a whole is that its strategic priorities changed on a regular basis, in line to some extent with shifting global priorities. Before the 1990s, before I joined UNDP, and I can talk directly about it, supposedly the organization provided technical assistance. So hopefully it was giving practical advice to developing countries about how to carry out development. By the 1990s, however, you saw a shift more to overall thematic kind of focus areas. First, to human development. When I first joined UNDP, I joined the Global Human Development Report before some other people here at speakers today. Then, very briefly, it was interesting, we shifted from human development in the early 1990s to what people were calling sustainable human development. I mention that because now we're in a process of this figuring out what the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be internationally going forward post-2015. Quickly, though, by 1995, UNDP shifted to poverty reduction as its focus. And now, as you know, it shifted by 2000 to the Millennium Development Goals, along with the rest of the international development community. What is noteworthy about UNDP and many other agencies in the UN system is it was not really well resourced to support development programs at the national level. It did have resources at the national level to help coordinate UN efforts and to seek to coordinate the larger development community. It did this through this resident coordinator system at the national level. But in fact, if you looked at the larger development community, it did not really, in fact, coordinate most of its efforts at the national level. Why was that the case? It's fairly obvious that bilateral donors in particular respond primarily to their own political constituencies in their home countries. They don't respond not to the ODA requirements, for example, of the countries they're giving aid to. And few national governments, more now than back in the 1990s, few national governments have had the capacity to ensure some degree of coherence across myriad donor efforts in their countries. So as a result, if you really looked at the practice at the national level and you summed it up, you'd see that in reality there have been a lot of relatively small-scale pilot programs across a multitude, a wide variety of development areas. Any degree of coherence among donors arose mainly from what I guess my cynical remark, a pronounced tendency to endorse fads. For example, you see that two relatively recent prominent examples have been microfinance and cash transfers. And once such programs appear to be successful in one or two countries, it seems that they crop up almost everywhere. I say this because, for example, I directed the International Poverty Center in Brazil for a while, and almost all the queries from outside of Brazil to us about what was going on in terms of development were focused on cash transfers at that particular time. So it dominated everybody's attention, even though Brazil was carrying out a lot of other interesting development efforts. The problem is, even if you have these particular kind of programs, at the end of the day, if you want to scale them up, either the government has to do it, which in many cases is not going to be practical, except in emerging economies, or you're going to have to access funds from larger public financial institutions. We're talking about the World Bank or regional development banks, like the Asian Development Bank or the African Development Bank. And these institutions do have resources to make a difference at the national level. Governments listen to them because of the scale of the financing available, as well as often their borrower relationship to these institutions. In the 1990s, from my perspective, unfortunately, the policies of these kinds of institutions still reflected the conditionalities that were part of the stabilization and structural adjustment programs, which were initiated in response to the very grave, widespread debt crisis of the 1980s. When we look at the 1990s, we have to realize that human development, which became a very influential trend, arose in the late 1980s as a response to this kind of approach of structural adjustment and economic stabilization. For example, UNICEF's structural adjustment with a human face is supposed to be there, the term face, in 1987, and then the publication in 1990 of the first Human Development Report. But again, to come back to this topic of sort of the kaleidoscope of shifting donor priorities over time, human development, indeed, I would argue, had a tremendous influence on the international development community. I would argue it had a decisive influence on the framing of the MDGs in 2000, 2001. We can debate that. But its initial influence was mainly on social policies, namely education, health, nutrition, and so forth, on social development in general. It did not have much impact, in fact, on economic policies, which changed, I would argue, only marginally in the 1990s. And so the critique mainly was from a human development perspective. Economic policies were judged primarily on the basis of whether they contributed to cutting expenditures on health and education, two of the three components of the well-known Human Development Index. And then with the poverty focus, economic policies were now judged on the basis of whether they contributed to the spread of poverty. This had been one of the main critiques of structural adjustment austerity. By 1995, the international development community had shifted clearly to the focus on poverty reduction, formally initiated by the 1995 World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen. This galvanized UNDP into action, really, during this period, 1995 onward. It really took a very active role in supporting the formulation of many of the initial poverty reduction programs of developing countries. By 1999, the World Bank and even the IMF got on board and joined the initiative by launching national poverty reduction strategy papers, essentially, though, I would say, as an appendage to structural adjustment programs. So the problem was that when we looked at the outcomes, even with the MDGs, while the social programs underwent some significant changes, you could argue, focusing more, for example, on the extreme income poor, namely those living on less than $1 per day in purchasing power parity terms. On the economic strategy still did not change substantially. So what you had, I would argue, is that the adoption of such a disjointed strategic framework led to extensive tortured discussions. For example, for many years, a debate that I was involved with on the feasibility of achieving pro-poor growth. Namely, you want more rapid growth, but you want the more deprived members of the society to have a disproportionate benefit from that growth. Very difficult to do in practice. It's a long discussion of how that could happen. A major problem, though, that I would point out is that national governments during this whole time and during these changing priorities had relatively restricted choices. They had what you could call limited policy space when they were urged to adopt either the earlier structural adjustment programs, which carried over into the 1990s and part of the 2000s, or poverty reduction strategies, or both together now. So a key question for me still is, going forward, how successful can national development efforts be under such donor-initiated policy constraints? Envisioning, looking ahead very briefly, I think I must be getting towards the end of the presentation, looking at a so-called post-2015 development consensus could be, I would argue the national ownership of development policy should remain a priority concern, at least among low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. Many of the large emerging economies, obviously Brazil, China, even India, have enough autonomy to figure out what they want to do. Greater donor coordination would also be desirable, but hopefully not on the basis of the hegemony of the Bretton Woods institutions. Unfortunately, if you look at these two different objectives, national ownership and donor coordination, they don't necessarily fit together very neatly. They can, in fact, be contradictory in practice. This point relates to some of the controversy about the allegedly top-down adoption of the MDGs, especially the MDG targets, such as halving income poverty by 2015. Many developing countries objected that they didn't have any input into those particular decisions on the targets themselves. And there certainly is a very valid concern that uniform global targets are often not consistent with national headlines. The MDG framework was generally workable, I would argue. There were 8 main goals, although the last one on developed countries didn't have much teeth in it. There were really no targets there to speak of. The targets, I think, with some notable exceptions, were generally feasible, because if you talk to the people who framed the targets, they basically looked at trends between 1990 and 2000, took that trend line and said, well, going forward, what would be reasonable to be able to achieve? And it had a compelling focus, namely poverty reduction, which appealed to developed country donors. However, current efforts seem much more ambitious. So we're in the midst of obviously trying to figure out what the post-2015 development agenda is going to be at the global level. It's a very tortured, difficult discussion. If you look, for example, at one of the seminal reports recently, the report of the UN High-Level Panel on Post-2015 Development Agenda, it has, instead of 8 goals, it has 12 major goals. It has a myriad of targets and proposed indicators, some for which there will be little data available. So we're in a very difficult situation trying to come up with a realistic perspective. In other words, there could be another clear danger that donorship will inevitably prevail over ownership. Last couple of slides here, summing up in a sense. If national ownership prevailed, would poverty reduction, namely the currently proposed elimination of extreme poverty, dominate policy making? Is such a focus politically viable at the national level? Namely, thinking about the politics of it, what is the political base for poverty reduction as the core of your national strategy? It's probably a relatively small base in many countries. For example, inclusive growth already internationally has replaced pro-poor growth as the commonly accepted economic strategy. But the problem with inclusive growth, now including a broader proportion of the population, that's not a problem. Many of the non-poor can benefit from such a development stance. That's the advantage of it. The problem is that who should be included and on what priority should they be included? Last slide. So a few summing up questions very quickly. How should equity concerns be extended beyond the extreme poor? Shall we go to the 99% as we had an earlier discussion on? Is that politically viable in developing countries? Does it make sense? How can economic policies and social policies be made more strategically compatible? How could a new global development framework be made consistent with national ownership of policies? On what basis can greater donor coordination be achieved? And for example, what will be the future role of the UN system and the Bretton Woods institutions? What country blocks will they essentially represent? What role will the emerging economies represent? All these are fairly tough questions. There are no easy answers, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McKinley. Next, we have Gwen Hines. Gwen is the Executive Director for the UK at the World Bank. Unfortunately, Gwen did her undergraduate work at the other place, but she's gone on to do better things since then. Don't worry, she was for many years at DFID, before at the World Bank. So Gwen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, Terry set me up really nicely because I think there is a real issue between donorship and ownership, and I think I would argue that actually what we try and do is be somewhere in the middle, and there are constraints on both sides. So maybe I can talk a little bit more about the donor side of the constraints. And earlier in the day, you've heard presentations about what's happening and so on. I think this session is more to provoke you all to think a little bit. We won't necessarily be giving you the answers, but hopefully complicating your lives a little bit. So I am the UK Executive Director at the World Bank. Someone described it to me as a bit like an ambassador with more economics, so you can see if that's true. I started my life in the Foreign Office, but actually since '98 I've been a development person in DFID, which is the UK government department that runs not just aid programs, but also aid policies. And that was a very conscious decision at the time to put everything to do with development in one government department and to have a cabinet ranking minister. So it's pretty unique in the world where the Secretary of State for Development sits in the cabinet and argues a development corner. Of course, we all try to be terribly joined up, but I can tell you that when I was overseas running DFID programs, when I'm sitting now at the board, it is pretty unique. And we like to think makes us that bit more focused on the objective development questions. Lots of things, because I was coming at the end, I didn't quite know what you want to hear, so I'm going to flick through some of these slides. But the first one is, why does the UK give aid? It's important to think about this, because in some countries, as I say, it's different. If your development ministry is based in your foreign ministry, you might have one set of objectives. If you have a joint development and trade minister, which lots of countries do, you again might have a different set of objectives. In the UK, we're an island. We're an island which has always been international for many, many hundreds of years, and there's a feeling that we are always going to remain international. There's a very strong push in DFID about this being a moral and a social responsibility. The Prime Minister said very much, when there was all this discussion about should you cut the aid budget after the crisis, he said, we are not going to balance our books on the backs of the poor. And that moral responsibility to help people who are worse off than us is very important in the UK. But if that doesn't convince you, there's plenty of other reasons where it's in our social self-interest. Communicable diseases don't stop at borders. TB is rising in the UK. All these things you deal with every day when you're living in Africa, HIV, TB, all these things, they end up in the UK. Most of the humanitarian aid we spend as the UK is actually to do with conflict zones. So dealing with those conflict zones at the beginning, trying to figure out which of the countries dropping into fragility, what do we do about them? For a long time, everybody ignored Somalia. It's a failed state. We don't know what to do with it. The Sahel now is becoming a real concern for the UK. The Middle East, regions we thought were more stable because they were growing really, really well, are now becoming things with a direct national interest. So that's really important. Flick through all this. I assume, we can talk more about what does aid work and is it still needed. If you don't think it's needed, go visit low-income countries like Malawi. So I'm going to talk about ingredients for development success. 20 years from now, maybe 15, because you're all much smarter than me, you're doing my job. You've read all these books, you try and spend your time doing some research, you have very smart people across the world who feed you lots of information, you have NGOs who tell you you're doing it all wrong. You have all these different things going on. You sit on a board of 25. Those 25 represent all the different World Bank members in the world. And you work by consensus. And you're trying to figure out when a project comes to the board, do you approve it, do you not? When you're thinking about how do we make the World Bank more effective, we've had a new president at the World Bank for the last 18 months. We're knee-deep in change. So we're trying to think about his essay question. How do we eradicate poverty faster than current trends? How do we eradicate poverty this generation, your generation, my generation? How do we do that? How do we deal with inequality, growth, shared prosperity? It's all about what makes things more effective. This is my personal view, okay? This is not a British government view. Firstly, decide what you're aiming for. So we heard before about the Millennium Development Goals. Lots of debates, as Terry was saying, about where these came from, where they imposed. But it was the first time that we had, in the UK, in many other international forums, a set of, look, what are we collectively trying to achieve? And it framed a lot of the dialogue and the discussion and the country strategies. We haven't achieved all of those. Interesting research to what extent setting those goals actually changed behavior. General feelings we heard earlier. Poverty was largely achieved by India and China. They might have done that anyway, but if you think of things like health and education, Homi Karas, who's much smarter than me, has done some research suggesting it potentially did change behavior by focusing on particular issues. But a recognition we didn't get it all right. Counting how many kids turn up at school one day is largely irrelevant, especially if you do school feeding. They all turn up in the morning. They're all gone by lunchtime, and they don't pass. So now we know it's about the quality of schooling which really, really makes a difference. So now we're thinking about post-2015 because the MDGs expire in 2015. In discussing that, there was a key issue. How do we discuss what happens next without letting people off the hook of what we're already supposed to be doing? Maternal mortality, way, way, way off track. Poverty and inequality, nutrition. Nutrition is off track pretty much everywhere, including in countries who've done really, really well on poverty and growth. India, a lot of South Asia, way, way, way off track on nutrition. So it's been difficult to say, finish the unfinished business, but then things have moved on. So issues like good governance, you've heard a lot about today. Why Nations Fail is also one of my recommended reading list. Governance is incredibly important. So it is going to be very, very difficult to agree globally. What do we now think we should collectively focus on? So this was a suggested list of 12 goals, 54 targets. This has all still got to be negotiated. And you can take a bet with me whether it's the 31st of December 2015, whether it's even in 2015. But if we don't have a framework, there is a concern that we will go back to trying to do all sorts of different things. What does this mean for DFID? DFID's Secretary of State is a management accountant. Our previous Secretary of State was an investment banker. There's a lot of management speak coming into development, not just in the UK, but more globally. But there's a real sense that we need to set strategic targets. This also is part of the deal, frankly, with those of you who are UK taxpayers. If we're going to grow the aid budget, we need to tell you what we're going to get. So there was a big push. We were all on holiday as country heads. When you're overseas, school finishes early. So I was on holiday. Election happened. Come back. We need a business plan for your country program in Malawi. And that was a good thing, actually, frankly, in terms of getting us to think not just about, I'm going to get more kids in school, and that makes me feel warm and cuddly, and that's great. But how many more kids is enough? It's very difficult. We all spent a long time saying it's terribly complicated, you can't do it, there's all these issues with attribution and qualitative, quantitative. But having to think about it was important. So at the highest level, the DFID business plan for 2010 to 2015, lifetime of Parliament, is around these issues. So December, last month, We were the first G8 country to achieve 0.7. That target was set in the 70s. You can argue whether it's still relevant, but frankly, that was long overdue. Very, very few countries who've done that. These transparency issues, the value for money, is really, really important in the UK. There will never be enough money in many developing countries. When I was in Malawi, the government's budget, including aid, was $120 per person per year for health, education, cash transfers, agriculture, roads, anything. There is not enough money, so making sure you get the most out of every dollar, every kwacha, every pound is really important. And then, as I say, thinking about wealth creation, which is code for jobs and private sector development and graduating countries out of poverty. Fragile states. If you project forward to 2030, we have a problem with fragile states. And then lives of women and girls. So, these are the specific things which are in the business plan. This is not everything that DFID does, but this was an attempt to say, right, for the UK aid money, this is the minimum we will achieve that you can count. Lots of boring but important things which you can't count, but we will be transparent about this. The World Bank is now going through the same process. We've agreed 2 high-level goals: eradicating extreme poverty in the generation. Whether it's 3%, 2%, we can argue about, but the basic idea, can we eradicate poverty in the generation? And then shared prosperity. And this issue of tracking the welfare of the bottom, we got in there. It is about inequality, but also jobs and other things that you might need. So long debates now when every country's strategy comes forward about how we do that. And the cross-cutting environmental issues, fiscal, social sustainability too. Learn lessons from the past. It's all right, it speeds up. These were all the boring but important conferences which many of us sat through about what are the basic principles on aid effectiveness. That all is difficult enough. Now it gets more complicated. We know aid isn't sufficient. So actually, even if we made aid brilliant, we have all these other issues to deal with. Simplicity and complexity. The MDGs help to focus people, but as Terry said, it's a lot more complicated, particularly at the country level. Good institutions matter, but that is the hardest one to get. That is incredibly difficult and takes decades in many cases. And then the last one, we need to know what we don't know, which is a bit of a get-out, but also says we need to do a lot more evidence about what we don't know and be much more honest. Adapt to new challenges and opportunities. If it was steady state, you think we could figure on that, but it's not a steady state. Everything is changing. Some positive, some negative. Huge issues. Scary slide. If you map all the things coming up, you can see that we have some real problems. And a lot of those problems are overlapping. If you map out to 2030, there's 50 countries with 98% of poverty on current trends. But India and China are going in the right direction. So that's okay. Help them through development assistance to the extent we can, through other means, trade, to do what they're doing. Africa, many countries are not going in the right direction. Rapidly expanding populations, big problems with climate change, conflict, all these other issues. Africa is a real problem. If we can't make faster progress in Nigeria, in DRC, in Madagascar, these kind of countries, you cannot achieve 3 by 30 of this eradicating poverty. And that's difficult because we don't know how to do that bit. Remember, the world's complex, in case you're not confused enough. Sorry, go back once. Right, when I was first doing development and everybody was talking about aid effectiveness, and even at Paris to a certain extent, you can't really see the arrows here, and frankly, I got bored drawing them. But it's a slide from Fengler and Carras about the new realities of aid. Aid is complicated. When I ran DFID's World Bank team in '98, the whole plan was simplify things. What does the UN do? What does the World Bank do? What does the Asian Bank, the African Bank? What does everyone do? What does the bilateral do? I've come back to it now, and actually everyone's stopped talking about that because it's frankly so complicated. Because we have everybody giving money to each other. DFID's in the process of doing a traceability study. If you look at a country like Tanzania, you mistakenly think, or I did when I got there, that actually I would give money to NGOs and they give it to people in the villages. It's not the reality. Everyone is subcontracting and subcontracting and so on. Some are better, some are worse. So actually the traceability and the overheads and who's doing what and who's working with who is the next level of aid coordination, aid effectiveness. Just to prove to you, it's now all about management speak. I did politics and economics first, so I could call myself a political economist, which was good because suddenly that became trendy. Now the new thing is behavioral economics. I did psychology a few years ago because I got so fed up with all this rational economic decision-making. People aren't rational. And the governance structures and the decisions people make, particularly in very poor, resource-constrained, difficult governance environments, are textbooks-wise not remotely rational. My big thing, I was telling somebody earlier, chief economists in the World Bank and DFID, they chat a lot. I've said to them, can you do more research on the second best? Because the first best is great, but actually my life as a DFID country program manager was, which of these suboptimal choices is least suboptimal? And actually those are the decisions you make. So all these things about, that's great, but when you set a target, what is the unintended consequence? So lots of business for economists looking forwards, but think about these less rational bits too. Lastly, persistent optimism is absolutely essential if you're going to work in international development. These are two of my favorite quotes at the moment. I hate these books like Dead Aid. I throw them across the room. Because frankly, life is more complicated. I am still very optimistic about development. My husband's private sector, after 8 years in developing countries, he came away incredibly depressed because he just saw all the bad bits. Well, I see all the bad bits, but I also see the good bits, the things that do get better, the people who are trying to make it better, the things that do progress. And you've heard lots of success stories today. And things go forward and they go back and then they go forward again. And actually it's my role, and any of you who are in this field, to think, how do we actually make it better? So I think the top one, I wouldn't use it on my performance report with my minister, but I think that's how it feels a lot of the time. And I think the second one is right. It isn't about whether aid fails. Aid does some good things some of the time. It could do better. And that is a challenge for all of us. Thank you.
That's good. I'm pleased to introduce now Dr. John Rapley, who is an extremely trendy political economist. You don't have to know that he's a political economist to think that he's wearing Converse All-Stars, so he's clearly could be trendy, because I can't wear them because I'm not cool enough. Anyway, he's currently at the Centre for Development Studies here in Cambridge. I'm slightly confused as to why he's here, because from 2003 to 11, Dr. Rapley was running a think tank in the Caribbean. Which I would never leave if I was running a think tank in the Caribbean. That sounds absolutely brilliant. But nonetheless, I'm very pleased he has dragged himself back to Cambridge with the wonderful weather to speak to us. So over to you.
Thank you. All right, last man at bat. If it were cricket, of course, that would be a rather sad position to find oneself in. But I'm going to use a baseball analogy and imagine that the bases have been loaded by my colleagues and it's just hit the last home run and the match is over. But what I would say is, wrapping things up, where do we go from here? I think we're living at the end of an age, and the end of an age, to sort of pick up where Gwen left off, it's exhilarating and it's frightening. There's challenges and opportunities, and they are huge, but they go together. And to put that age in a bit of a context, this basically is the end of the age to which we come to the conclusion of 200 years ago, roughly. I mean, we lived in a world where there weren't rich and poor countries. There were rich and poor people, but fundamentally incomes were at much the same level. And then you had that period which coincided with the age of empire, in which there was this massive divergence. And it reached its peak. It lasted a full 2 centuries. In fact, history will record that 1999 was the peak of the West, and that was the year in which a small number of developed market economies in the OECD accounted for 4/5 of global consumption. And that was, at the time, there was talk, it was, those of you old enough to remember the 1999, there was this exhilaration at the time that we're entering a new age. Well, in fact, it was really the end of an age. Because from then on, there's been a rather sharp downward adjustment. And today, that figure is down to about 3/5 of global output. And as we know, things are changing. I mean, it doesn't take a Nobel Prize in economics to figure out that this is unsustainable, although, in fact, all sorts of Nobel Prizes were given to economists who said it was sustainable. Nonetheless, you just have to look at the record of history. And anytime you have this kind of spatial divergence, there's going to be convergence, and the greater the gap has become, the more painful it can be. I was living in the Caribbean at the time. I was right through this period. The 90s were a particularly turbulent decade in developing countries. And so I was on the front lines observing what was happening, and I saw it then. I was trying to make sense of it, but I understood it to be essentially an unraveling of this, the beginning of the end, and it's sort of the way this played itself out as a political economist would be in a series of sort of critical events, specifically financial crisis, starting about around 94 with the Mexican peso crisis, and then the Asian crisis, and the ruble crisis. And in 2004, I published a book, and I predicted that what was now happening was that this set of crises was going to work its way right into the heartland of the global economy. So I was actually one of the few people smiling when, needless to say, the global financial crisis hit in 2008, although sadly it didn't do anything for my book sales. But nonetheless, I tell you all this because there's an interesting story that goes along with this. In the same year I published that book, an old friend of mine from my Oxford days, I do apologize, but anyway, yes, I suffered from my sins. My parents met at Oxford, I should point out. When I told my mother I was moving to Cambridge, she asked me if it was a recognized university. But without irony, I should point out. But a friend of mine from my Oxford days had published a book just in the same year on the fall of the Roman Empire, and we happened to bump into one another after many years of not seeing each other. Funnily enough, at a cottage in the south of France. I was then lecturing in France, and we were comparing notes. And what struck us is how similar what we were looking at in two entirely different time periods, a lot of the manifestations were. And we decided to together, it began a long process, which is now only just now, 10 years on, coming to fruition, which is to write a book together, which is to try and come up with a general theory about the unfolding of an empire, the end of an empire. And what we hypothesize is essentially what happens when you have this kind of gap. The convergence is affected by the mobile factor of production. Now, in antiquity, capital was not mobile. You couldn't sort of break up an aqueduct and cart it off to the northern forest, but mobile was, and labor was. And so what you had was the barbarian invasions, essentially, and from there, the radiation outwards, and a rough equalization, although albeit at a much lower level of production and income throughout Europe. And today, of course, we live in a very different world, but labor is not mobile. It's quite the contrary. Labor is quite immobile. It's locked up by immigration policies, by border controls. But of course, what is completely mobile now is capital. And you see this sort of thing happening, the trend that was starting actually pretty early on, but it really goes into hyperdrive in this century. If you look, this is just a recent snapshot from the Financial Times, and you can see that emerging markets are now attracting the largest share of global capital inflows. And this is taking the form, of course, of corporate outsourcing. So in other words, the barbarians today are not shaggy hordes, they're actually hedge fund managers. But the process began a long time ago. These are just two curves I very quickly plotted using Excel this afternoon, as you can guess, but two curves. The blue curve is the developed industrial economies, the OECD, what, for the want of a better word, we'll call the imperial heartland. And the red is the rest, okay, the periphery, if you will. And you can see that from about, this is 1980. That's when the process really begins, and why it starts then, why it's delayed so long, and delayed and noticeably a few decades after independence, because divergence continued after all these colonies had got their independence. It was only quite a bit later. That's a topic of a great debate among economists, and I'm not going to get drawn into that. The significant thing is that you can see that by the 1990s, that short boom at the end of the 1990s, you've seen the blue curves, the last time the peak goes up to close to 4%, 3-4% average annual growth, was actually in hindsight, well, I mean, it was apparent at the time, but it wasn't apparent to people like, or if it was apparent, people like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton who were talking about this endless dawn weren't telling us that that was a cyclical effect of the Asian crisis, a massive flood of capital into the so-called safe havens, which inflated stock markets, giving an impression of a boom. But the truth is, the unraveling had begun. Now, if you're sanguine about this, and if you're an exponent of the free market, as many are, you say, well, this is great. This just shows capitalism works, convergence is happening, incomes are going to rise across the board, and we're all going to live happily ever after. But as you will have heard in presentations earlier today, it's actually not that simple. Nor was it simple at the fall of the Roman Empire. And I think there's some very salutary lessons. I'm not one of these people who says history repeats itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And I think there are lessons, and I think there are common trends we can learn a lot from. That while you had that kind of convergence across space, so you didn't have rich and poor regions in Europe the way you had at the height of the Roman Empire, what you did have is you had rich and poor people as you do today. And so the fact that now the world's billionaires and soon trillionaires might have names like Slim or Modi or Abramovich, doesn't change the fact that we're living in a world where we're getting the emergence of a phenomenally wealthy and increasingly politically powerful class and a widening gap between rich and poor. Now, this is more than just an ethical issue. It becomes an issue about the whole sustainability of the political model and whether, in fact, we are still talking about living in a capitalist free market. Because one of the things, as you will have heard earlier, is there's increasing interpenetration of these economic elites and political elites. Increasingly, to a very considerable degree, their economic success depends on control of government policy, whether it's buying privatization licenses in developing countries, whether it's Russian oligarchs using their links to political elites, or whether it's bankers securing policies. I mean, essentially using the government's monetary or the state's monetary policy as a means to inflate their revenues. What we're seeing is a close fusion of political and economic power. But the other thing is this, and I don't know if any of you have come across this study by the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, but they did a network analysis 2 years ago. Fascinating conclusions. Essentially what you have here, this is a graphical representation of the links. They took a survey of the 1,000-odd biggest companies in the world, which account for nearly all the publicly traded shares in the world economy. And they looked at cross-shareholdings and cross-directorships. And what emerged was a tight degree, and there's a small cross-section from this central part here, where the red nodes. They narrowed it down. It was rather striking that at the pinnacle of the world economy, something like 40% of these publicly listed assets are controlled by literally a few dozen large financial corporations managed by these extraordinarily wealthy individuals. Moreover, the danger of this very tight interlinking is, of course, that it can create barriers to market entry. Now, this is consistent with more research we're seeing on class mobility, which is suggesting that we're seeing less and less class mobility in both directions. I mean, I think it's an interesting aside that after the 1929 market crash, I mean, the iconic image of the 1929 market crash is of people jumping off buildings because their fortune has been wiped out overnight. And fortunes were wiped out overnight. After the most recent crash, no fortunes were wiped out. I mean, asset values fell. They have since come back up. I haven't heard of anybody jumping off a building. I mean, there was a couple of bankers who killed themselves. If they'd stuck around long enough, they would have been fine. But the interesting thing, what did happen, a very different resolution, of course, has been a large-scale assumption of liability by governments. That is now being transferred onto the shoulders of the rest of us in the form of both service cuts and tax increases. And those service cuts are a bit worrying because if they're going to, in fact, further inhibit mobility, if that were the effect, and in some of the more marginal countries, that is likely to be the effect, that's going to have worrying implications for mobility. But the picture that emerges from all this, where am I leading you? Why do I call it a new medievalism? Is because when you have an economy with increasingly polarized class divisions, less and less class mobility, less essentially a hereditary elite with increasing links to power, what I'm arguing is that it's really not appropriate to talk about this being the free market capitalism. The danger, I wouldn't say we're there, but the danger is that this could gradually slide into being a new feudalism, essentially, where, and with negative impacts for economic productivity. But there's also another thing I want to draw your attention to, which is, well, what is the political reaction to this? How are the people of the world reacting? Well, there's a couple of ways. The obvious way, which which is take to the streets. The Occupy movements, which some say were a flash in the pan, and others say actually, well, they've percolated through the society and they're having an impact. That is one response. But there's another, the one that really interests me and that I started observing living in the developing world during that period of intense and painful austerity of the 80s and 90s. One of the manifestations I found is actually, it's more subtle, but it's more insidious and potentially more challenging. And it is something that scholars of politics have known about for centuries. I mean, Ibn Khaldun wrote about it 7 centuries ago. And it is that when people perceive a disconnect between what they pay in taxes and what they are getting in return, they have the option of retreating in various ways and evading taxes. And so this gave rise to the growth of, in particularly, this peak appeared in many developing countries in the 90s, the growth of the informal sector. Now, that can create a situation where government capacity, the very mechanism, the state that we look to sort of lead us through this process, if the state lacks the capacity to actually manage the society, you have a real challenge. And if it reaches the point where citizens, what happens, of course, is when they evade taxes, is governments usually respond by raising taxes further on those they can catch, which further incentivizes tax evasion. Now, I'll tell you an interesting story. I mean, I'll tell you a story from Kingston, Jamaica, but this is something you see in cities all over the contemporary developing world, and we're now starting to see it in cities, particularly in Southern Europe, but even in some places, in some neighborhoods in the north of England. People would say, well, you know, Jamaicans don't pay their taxes, and, you know, being an adopted Jamaican, I can say, well, that's only partially true. We pay taxes. We're not necessarily paying taxes to the government, all right? There are communities in the city, right, where if you're a businessman and you are a businesswoman and the goods are stolen from your shop, you're not going to go to the police. The police are underpaid, they're corrupt, they're under-resourced, they're inefficient, but you will find a local gang leader who is able to sort this out for you, right? And the other thing is you're paying taxes to that gang leader. They call it, what polite society calls it, is a protection racket or extortion. But what the gang leaders, because I got really quite interested in this business, and I started to do research in the drug trade and interviewing gangsters and drug barons, which was really quite an interesting, I can give you some very interesting advice on research methods and what not to do. But they would refer to it as tax, and they would point out, they'd say, well, look, you know, if you don't pay your taxes to the government and they find out, they put you in prison. I don't have a prison, so I break the guy's legs. Same thing, right? It's just I'm enforcing voluntary compliance, but they are getting a better service. And speaking with the business people, they would say the same thing. So, you see, the state won't collapse anywhere because nature abhors a vacuum, and it's in human nature to want order. So when the state capacity is eroded by this kind of what I would call unevenly falling austerity, citizens find these adaptations. Again, if you're a libertarian, you'll say, well, that's fine, that's a good thing. But the problem with this kind of adaptation, this kind of politics, is it doesn't lend itself to economic growth. It tends to, because time horizons are short, political stability tends to increase because the local baron will change from one year to the next, and so investment decisions tend to have short time horizons, and countries with very advanced neo-medievalism, as I call it, tend to have low growth rates. Now, could it come into the West in this age as austerity reaches here? Well, I would say, you know, if you go into all you have to do is go into Athens today and you'll find neighborhoods where, in fact, vigilante gangs are collecting taxes from businesses and doing the job of the police because the police can't or won't do it. So I would say we have to be alert to this. Now, that's the challenge. The opportunity is, I think there's a general consensus that, you know, this isn't sustainable. But the irony or the paradox of it is that, I mean, if you really do think of yourself as a fan of capitalism, and you think capitalism and the free market is great, probably what you should be doing is joining something like Occupy, because it's probably the best hope. That kind of urban, you know, mobilization, simply because that's a politics that seeks at least, whether or not you share the views, what they see as a solution, they nonetheless take the view that we can engage with the political process, and I think that will carry us a lot further than a retreat from the state altogether where people disengage completely, because that is a real dangerous and very slippery slope to get onto. But I think it is a risk that we have the choice, I think, with the end of this age of empire. We can move into the high Middle Ages, if you will, which is a relatively egalitarian age and very promising and culturally full of possibility, or we could just choose to move into a dark age. All right, I think I've probably stirred the pot enough.
Thank you very much, John. If I can invite our speakers to put on their lapel mics so they can answer questions. And please don't be shy. Who would like to ask a question? Yes. Microphone.
Dr. Rapley, this is a question for you. I was thinking about, can you elaborate a little bit more on your idea about this capital mobility and convergence? I suppose, in my naive view, the capital mobility probably gonna cause higher divergence even. So I'm not quite understanding the story of capital mobility and convergence.
Sorry, is this on? Yeah, it is on. Okay, you're asking if capital mobility goes along with greater divergence? The more divergence. That has tended to be the case so far, and the reason for that appears to be that because capital is highly globalized, as I illustrated from that spider chart, but states are not. And so what they're able to do is there has tended to be, and this has shown up first in developing countries, the so-called race to the bottom in tax policy. So you shift the burden of taxation away again from the mobile factor onto the immobile factor. So there's been a shift globally towards more and more taxes on consumption, fewer and fewer taxes on capital. So the mobility of capital, the result is that the returns on capital are going up. And they're able, of course, because of the ease of movement, to bank it offshore and to put it, to find all sorts of creative and many of them legal ways to evade or avoid taxes. But that same kind of bargaining power, if you will, you have an unequal bargaining power, if you will, between the two factors of production, because labor's locked up in states. So we need to have more international coordination on things like tax policy, I think, to deal with that.
And another question? Anyone at all? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your insights. I'm Alexandra, I'm first-year London economist. Recently, as we all know, the economic situation of most of the MEDCs became worse because of the economic crisis, and lots of people, as could be observed, started to question whether and to what extent MEDCs should contribute to international aid while themselves suffering economic problems. So my question is, to what extent these public moods are influencing the work of UN and international financial organizations' work? Thank you.
Shall I go for that one? Okay. In the UK, it's obviously a very hot debate. And there are regularly articles saying, why are we increasing our aid budget? We can't afford to do this, and so on. This is what has really catalyzed this whole focus on treating aid like an investment. So the first thing that the new coalition government did when they came in 2010 was to make things much more transparent. So I was then in Malawi, then moved to Bangladesh. So all the payments we did became public. Believe me, most aid agencies in the world don't do that. And it was kind of interesting with my staff of, right, your travel expenses and your payments and things are all now on the web. And further complications, because 3/4 of my staff were non-native English speakers. So I had to spend the first few weeks trying to correct people's grammar and things like that, which is boring, but apparently was important, so you could all read it properly. So the transparency is part of it, to say, it will be really clear what we're doing. And DIF has done a lot of work on its website, so you now can see what's going on. And it's not widely known, but whilst the aid budget has been increasing, DFID as a department has had the same kind of big admin, so running cost cuts, so cuts in people now, what you get when you travel overseas. It's now very much economy. You have to provide receipts for everything and so on. So really, really clamping down on that complete bans on communications and all sorts of things that we're not allowed to spend money on, which I think is right, frankly. But it does make it tough to manage. When I'm sitting in the World Bank, and being very frank, in the last 18 months since I got there, having cut budgets left, right, and centre in the last few years in DFID, there was a real sense that the multilaterals were out of line, actually, that they hadn't cut things we've cut. And it's partly because they don't have that same pressure, because the shareholders are indirect. So recently we've just done a new funding round for IDA, the World Bank's poor arm. That's largely paid for by European governments until now. So a lot of European governments said, right, we want the same kind of efficiency measures. So we're currently taking 400 million off the World Bank's running costs because of exactly these kind of issues, that actually we need to be efficient everywhere. And like I say, the running cost is just one part of it. Ultimately, it is about what does a dollar invested get you. So we're also now, we asked as part of the IDA negotiations that we benchmark unit costs around the world. So we find out, why does it cost more in Ghana than Zambia to educate a kid? There are reasons why it might cost more, but you should at least be asking the question. So definitely lots of business for economists, because cost-benefit analysis and rates of return and sensitivity analysis are now done routinely on aid projects in the way they weren't in the past.
Go ahead. And then...
I was just curious about all your opinions, but particularly Mrs. Hines, on the idea that it's not so much how much aid is increased by, but more how it is actually distributed. So I just wanted to know if you think that is a major problem and how it can be improved in order to make aid more effective to getting to the people that really need it.
I think Terry should answer this one as well. Of course, you know, as I said at the end, there is always more that you can do to make aid more effective. The UK, I forget how many years ago, at least 15, untied the aid. So UK aid doesn't automatically have to be spent on British companies because OECD research suggested it's worth 30% more if you don't have that condition. And it's taken a long time to try and negotiate that internationally. You know, when I was in Malawi, DFID was about 8% of the government's budget. That is huge. But I used to sit down regularly with the finance minister and talk about his challenges to fund other bits of the government. So yes, I'm managing my projects and my programs to make sure your taxpayers' money doesn't go astray. But the bigger gain is helping him think through, in a health sector with not enough resources, what can they afford? You know, big debates around the world at the moment about things like cancer. Can you afford, as developing countries, low-income countries, to pay for cancer treatment, or do you spend the money on malaria or, you know, diarrhea? Lots of issues like that. So it can always be more effective, and it's not obviously just choosing where you put the money. There's a lot of emphasis on that bit and getting the projects right and the budgets right. But a big discussion at the World Bank at the moment is the implementation. And my personal thing is the last mile. It's not even just the implementation in the project document. It's the stuff you do which is really hard to describe, but is what actually makes the real difference at the end of the day. Terry?
Yeah, instead of covering that same territory, I guess I would emphasize, go back to one of the points I made in the presentation, is that we've got to find a way of achieving greater coordination among the donors. Because we are in an austerity era, at least in the developed country world, UK is unusual in the sense that it's maintained its ODA levels, but many countries have not. So going forward, we're looking at restrictions on our ability to disperse aid. So if you're going to be in that situation, it's all the more important, I think, to make sure you're channeling funds to international organizations that will provide greater coordination. And that's the only way, I think, long run, you're going to be able to solve some of these issues. You can't do it bilaterally. I just don't think, despite the fact that UK is a prominent example of allocating a lot of funds.
Can I just flag one other? Sorry, I know I've already answered, but which might appeal to you guys as economists. One of the debates at the moment is how do you leverage private sector funding for development? So the essay question for you guys is infrastructure. We need 1.5 trillion a year, ballpark. There's lots of sovereign wealth funds, lots of pension funds. So the big debate at the moment is how do you persuade them to invest a percentage as a new asset class in developing countries? It's been tried on a small scale. I mean, as Terry says, there's a real kind of tendency from people to pick an issue and all crowd into that. And right now, everybody's crowding into this, and some coordination is definitely needed. But that's going to be a really, really big issue. The UK is graduating its grant aid from India. But what we're still looking at is how could we use what we're calling returnable capital, but basically equity investments or loan investments and things to help mobilize some of the billions and trillions which is out there. And how do you do technical assistance back to these original ideas alongside private sector funding? So that's a really big issue at the moment.
And one final question, you were keen.
To Mr. Rapley. So my question will be about social class mobility. If you let me define this social class term, loosely monetary terms, so social class is determined by monetary figures. I think quite often when development economists talk about social class, they focus on the transition between lower class and something like lower middle class. I think it's something most of them are concerned with about. Something I'm interested in, though, is the transition between the upper middle class and upper class. Because, for example, in countries, with developed institutions like the UK, for example, it looks like it's very immobile in between those two classes, say the class of millionaires and the class of billionaires. Moving in between is quite difficult. I mean, apart from Mark Zuckerberg, one of those people, it's quite difficult to come up with the name of the person who managed to do it within a lifetime. Whereas in countries with no institutions like Russia or Ukraine, I can name you at least 30 people who managed to become billionaires from being lower class in about 2-3 years. So something...
It was the same 2 or 3 years, wasn't it? It all happened at once, and there's no entry since.
Yeah, so, I mean, there are still people. I mean, I can give examples of people becoming millionaires within a year ago, for example. But it's not my question. My question is, do you think that as institutions develop, you're getting this rigidity in between upper middle class and upper class? And does this rigidity lead to global social class rigidity? I mean, in between lower class and middle class as well. Do institutions and their development, do they lead to more rigid social class mobility? Or do they not? Thanks.
That's a good question. I share your concern, actually, with the mobility at the upper end, partly because purely from a standpoint of economic efficiency. I mean, it's one of the things when I was living in the Caribbean, I sort of came to develop this theory of what I call anti-growth regimes, which are when a small group of powerful business interests can get together and more or less frustrate entry. The real challenge, therefore, is to entrepreneurship, that new startup firms, I mean, people with the idea, people with the drive, but getting capital was a problem, and this sort of thing was inhibiting. And what that meant, therefore, is that you had a non-competitive economic environment. So it's from the point of view of economic efficiency, as I say, quite apart from questions of social justice or political sustainability. I think it's a real problem. And the examples you cite, now, you know, if you look at some of these, and not all of them, I think there's probably more opportunity for the upper middle class in the developing countries at the moment to become, and it is happening. I think it's a bigger concern, it's a much bigger concern in the developed societies where you have that kind of hardening possibly taking place, but it could be a harbinger of what's coming. So I think, as I was saying to the earlier respondent, one of the things is that in negotiating, if you have a highly, I mean literally, if you read this, it's a very short study, I recommend you read it by the ETH Zurich. You're talking about a few hundred players highly networked in a way that governments simply are, I mean, they're being outmaneuvered. And so when it comes to something like tax policy, the willingness of even developed countries to race each other to the bottom, you know, has been very alarming. And that's going to be very concerning if that isn't tackled.
Great, thank you very much. I think we'll wrap up there, but before we say thank you, just to say after this will be our final keynote from Tanya Barron, so please do stick around for that. But all that's left to do is to say thank you to all of our speakers here.